The widow had one bowl of stew left. She gave it to a starving cowboy she had never seen before. 26 days later, that bowl came back as 3 freight wagons, a rebuilt ranch, and a fight over the only spring in the valley that never froze. But on the night Caleb Shaw first reached Red Willow Ranch, he had no wagon, no money, and almost no strength left to stay in the saddle. The first snow of 1886 had begun to gather along the Bitterroot Mountains. It came thin at first, blown sideways across the Montana Territory, whitening the sage and disappearing in the ruts of the old freight road. Caleb's sorrel gelding moved with its head low. So did Caleb. He had spent 12 years pushing cattle north, guiding freight through bad country, and sleeping beneath weather that would have emptied softer men from the trail. But experience could not fill an empty stomach. The cattle outfit that hired him in September had collapsed before payday. Its owner vanished east with the books, the money, and every promise he had made. Caleb had eaten half a hard biscuit the morning before. His horse had fared little better. Then, through the gray evening, he saw a thread of smoke rising beyond a line of bare cottonwoods. A small ranch stood there beneath the mountain shadow. One cabin, one leaning barn, a fenced pasture holding fewer than 70 head of thin cattle. Near the gate, a weathered board carried 2 fading words, Red Willow. Caleb stopped at the fence. Pride told him to keep riding. Hunger told the truth. He dismounted, removed his hat, and walked toward the porch with one hand resting lightly against the saddle so his knees would not betray him. The door opened before he could knock. Hannah Vale stood inside the frame, holding a lantern in one hand and a kitchen towel in the other. She was 38, with dark auburn hair pinned at the back of her neck and the watchful expression of someone who had learned that every stranger might bring either help or trouble. Behind her, a boy of 10 peered around the door jamb. Caleb lowered his eyes. "Evening, ma'am. I can split wood, mend fence, clean stalls, whatever you need. I was hoping to earn a plate." Hannah studied him. Then she looked past him at the horse. "How long since either of you ate?" Caleb tried to smile. "Long enough that I shouldn't lie about it." A chair scraped inside. An older man appeared near the hearth, broad-shouldered despite his bent back, his white beard tucked into the collar of a faded wool shirt. Hannah's father, Gideon Price, had once run freight teams over Lolo Pass. Age had weakened his legs, but not his judgment. He looked Caleb over once. "That man is about to fall." Caleb opened his mouth to object. Gideon pointed toward the table. "Fall in a chair, then. Easier on the floorboards." The boy grinned. Hannah stepped aside. "Come in." Warmth struck Caleb before the smell did. Then came onions, venison, barley, black pepper, and fresh bread. For one dangerous second, his body moved toward the stove before his manners caught up with him. Hannah lifted the lid from a black iron pot. There was one serving left. Caleb saw it. He also saw 3 empty bowls on the table that had been wiped too clean. A heel of bread sat beside them. The boy watched the pot, not the stranger. Hannah filled the last bowl anyway. She set it in front of Caleb with the bread. "My name is Hannah Vale. That's my son, Toby. My father is Gideon, Caleb Shaw." He looked at the bowl, then at the boy. "Ma'am, I can take half." "No, we can divide it." "No." Her voice was gentle but final. "You asked to earn a plate. You can earn it tomorrow. Tonight you eat." Caleb took one spoonful. The heat hurt his cracked lips. The salt made his eyes sting. He lowered his head so no one would mistake that reaction for weakness. Toby leaned forward. "Are you a real trail boss?" "Used to be." "What happened?" Caleb swallowed. "Trail ended before the pay did." Gideon gave a dry laugh. "That is the most Western answer I have heard all year." Caleb ate slowly after that, though every part of him wanted to empty the bowl in 6 bites. He left nothing behind, not a grain of barley, not a streak of broth. He used the last piece of bread to wipe the iron clean. Then he stood. "I'll cut wood before daylight." Hannah shook her head. "You can sleep in the barn. I said I would work." "And I said you can sleep." He reached into his coat and placed 2 nickels on the table. Hannah pushed them back. Caleb pushed them forward. She covered the coins with her palm and looked directly at him. That meal was not for sale. The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Caleb had spent years in camps where every kindness had a price attached. A bunk cost labor, a favor cost loyalty, a drink cost more than the bottle. But Hannah Vale had given away the last hot food in her house and refused to call him indebted. Caleb glanced toward the pantry. 2 jars of beans, a handful of potatoes, 1 sack of flour folded nearly flat. Winter had not truly begun, and Red Willow Ranch was already running out. He put his hat on. "I will remember this." Gideon leaned back in his chair. "Men say many things when they are warm. Caleb met the old man's eyes. Then judge me when it is cold. Before sunrise, Hannah found the barn empty. The stall had been cleaned, the wood box was stacked to the rim, her splitting maul had a new handle shaped from ash. Caleb's Shaw was gone. Only a set of hoofprints led north through the fresh snow. For the next week, the weather tightened around the valley. The temperature dropped. The creek skinned over with ice. The grass disappeared beneath 6 inches of snow, and Hannah began measuring feed by the forkful. Red Willow had 62 cattle. It had enough hay for perhaps 5 weeks. Less if the storms came hard. Hannah had already sold her late husband's best saddle, 2 milk cows, and half the tools from the machine shed. The bank in Missoula had refused another extension. Across the valley, Silas Rusk had offered to buy the ranch for less than the cabin and spring were worth. He had made the offer 3 times. Each time his number dropped. Gideon said that told them everything they needed to know. Rusk did not want Red Willow's cattle. He wanted its water. The spring behind the cottonwoods ran warm from underground rock. Even in the coldest winters, it stayed open. It fed the Vale cattle, then crossed the lower meadow and entered Rusk's south pasture. Without that spring, Rusk could graze only half the stock he owned. With it, he could double his herd. Hannah refused to sell. Rusk waited for winter to finish the argument. Then, on the 26th morning after Caleb left, Toby heard bells beyond the ridge. Not church bells, harness bells. He ran to the window. Ma! 3 freight wagons came down the northern road through falling snow. The first was pulled by 4 heavy mules. The second carried stacked hay beneath a canvas cover. The third rolled low beneath barrels, sacks, timber, and iron. Caleb Shaw rode beside them. His coat was the same, his hat was the same, but the man beneath them sat straight again. He stopped at the porch and dismounted. Hannah stepped outside without a shawl. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb looked at Gideon. Cold enough to judge me now? The old man stared at the wagons. Getting there. Toby tore across the yard and stopped just short of throwing his arms around Caleb. What is all that? Caleb glanced back. Flour, salt, coffee, dried apples, bacon, lamp oil, 2 rolls of roofing felt, fence staples, harness leather, 40 sacks of feed, 8 tons of hay. Hannah's face changed as the list grew. Caleb continued, boots for the boy, wool for your father, a new pump handle, seed grain for spring, and 3 windows that do not leak wind. She shook her head. No. Caleb's smile faded. No, we cannot take this. You already paid for it. With 1 bowl of stew? With the last bowl of stew. Hannah looked toward the wagons, then back at him. Where did you get the money? Caleb removed his gloves. 2 days after I left, I found a freight team turned over at Pine Cut. Driver had a broken arm, 6 mules were tangled in the traces, and a storm was closing the pass. Gideon's eyes sharpened. Whose outfit? Mercantile Freight, Silas Bell's line. Gideon let out a low whistle. Bell ran one of the largest winter routes between Missoula and the mining camps. Caleb had cut the mules free, righted the lead wagon with a block and tackle, and driven the cargo through the pass before the road vanished. Bell paid him for the rescue, advanced the first run, and let him take part of the payment in freight. Then he offered him a winter contract. 2 runs a month until the thaw, Caleb said. Half wages in cash, half in freight share. Hannah looked at the supplies. And you spent your first share here. Caleb met her gaze. I spent it where it started. Hannah had no answer to that, so Caleb turned to the drivers and began unloading. For 3 days, Red Willow Ranch sounded different. Axes struck clean wood. Hammers drove new shingles. Saw teeth moved through pine boards. The barn door, which had dragged in the dirt for 2 years, lifted square on new hinges. Caleb repaired the hay rack, reset 2 fence corners, and built a windbreak for the cattle. He taught Toby how to splice a rope without trapping his fingers. He sharpened Gideon's old draw knife and listened while the old freighter explained every bad decision ever made west of the Continental Divide. At night they ate together. Not richly, but no one counted spoonfuls. For the first time since her husband Samuel died beneath a falling cottonwood 2 winters earlier, Hannah heard a man's boots cross the porch without fear following them. Caleb never asked to stay. He simply kept finding work that needed doing, and Red Willow kept giving him reasons not to leave. By mid-December the cattle had gained weight. The barn roof no longer leaked. Toby had stopped waking at night when the wind shook the shutters. Then Silas Rusk arrived. He rode a black mare and wore a buffalo coat too fine for ranch work. 2 men followed him. One carried a leather document case. Rusk did not remove his gloves. Morning, Hannah. She stepped onto the porch. Silas. His eyes moved across the repaired barn, the stacked hay, and Caleb standing near the corral. "I see your circumstances have improved." "They have, temporarily." Caleb set down his hammer. Rusk smiled without warmth. "You must be the drifter." "Freight man," Caleb said. "Today, perhaps." Rusk opened the document case and removed a folded paper marked with the territorial seal. He handed it to Hannah. "The county accepted my water claim yesterday." The yard went still. Hannah read the first lines and felt the cold reach somewhere deeper than her hands. The claim did not take the whole ranch. It took something worse. The spring. According to Rusk's paper, an 1874 survey placed the spring in 12 acres of the upper meadow on his side of the boundary. If the claim stood, Red Willow's cattle could not legally drink there without his permission. Rusk looked toward the cottonwoods. "You may continue drawing water until the hearing." Hannah raised her eyes. "When?" 14 days. "And after that?" "After that you can purchase access." Gideon came out with his cane. "That spring belonged to this ranch before you owned a boot." Rusk's expression hardened. Memory is not title. Caleb took the paper from Hannah and examined the survey number. The ink was new. The seal was real. That combination bothered him more than an obvious forgery would have. Rusk turned toward his horse. "My earlier offer for the ranch remains open until the hearing." Hannah folded the claim once, then again. "Your offer can freeze with the rest of the valley." Rusk mounted. "We will see what freezes first." The county records room in Missoula occupied the back of a brick courthouse that smelled of coal smoke, wet wool, and old paper. Hannah, Caleb, Gideon, and Sheriff Nathan Cole arrived before noon the next day. The clerk brought out the land books. Red Willow's deed was there. The tax records were there. Samuel Vale's purchase receipt was there, but the original field survey for Section 18 was missing. The clerk searched twice, then a third time. "Survey Book 14 should contain the boundary notes," he said. "Pages 81 through 84 have been cut out." Caleb ran one finger along the clean edge near the binding. "Not torn, cut." Sheriff Cole looked toward the lock cabinet. "Who had access?" The clerk swallowed. "County officers, surveyors, attorneys with written leave." "And Silas Rusk?" The clerk hesitated. "His attorney inspected this book last month." Hannah closed her eyes. "That was not proof. It was only a direction." Judge Miriam Holt issued a temporary order the following morning. Until the hearing, both ranches could use the spring, but neither could alter the channel, fence the bank, or move a boundary marker. Rusk obeyed the words. He broke the spirit. His men drove 140 cattle into the lower pasture and crowded the spring from dawn until dark. They fouled the bank, churned the water into mud, and forced Red Willow's weaker stock back into the snow. Caleb and Hannah hauled barrels from a side creek. The creek froze solid 2 days later. They melted snow in iron drums. 10 buckets of dry snow collapsed into barely 1 bucket of water. The cattle needed hundreds of gallons a day. Then the real storm came. It buried the road in a single afternoon. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped below zero. Wind packed snow against the barn doors and tore one shutter from the cabin. Caleb and Toby worked by lantern to move the weakest cattle into shelter. A red heifer collapsed near the corral. Caleb knelt beside her, rubbing her neck, but her breathing had already gone shallow. Hannah stood in the blowing snow, holding a bucket of warm water that had come too late. The heifer died before midnight. That loss did not ruin the ranch. What it did was worse. It made the future visible. 1 animal tonight, 5 next week, 20 before the hearing. By morning, Hannah had made a decision. She placed Samuel's deed, the bank letters, and Rusk's purchase offer on the kitchen table. "I will sell him the lower half." Toby looked up sharply. "Ma, we keep the cabin in the north field." "There is no water in the north field," Gideon said. "I know." Caleb stood near the stove, snow melting from his coat. Hannah looked at him. "I will not watch the herd die to save a piece of ground." Caleb picked up Rusk's offer. The amount would pay the bank, settle the feed debt, and leave Hannah with enough to start again somewhere else. It was designed to feel merciful. That was what made it cruel. Caleb put the paper down. "Give me 1 day. For what? I do not know yet. Then what are you asking me to trust?" Caleb looked toward the empty bowl drying beside the stove. "The same thing you trusted when you opened that door." Hannah's jaw tightened. "That was a meal. This is my son's home." "I know." His voice dropped. "And that is why I am not asking for 14 days. Give me 1. Gideon had been silent through the argument. Now he stared at the claim map. "The line is wrong." Everyone turned. The old man tapped the paper with one bent finger. "Samuel showed me the boundary the year he bought this place. The surveyor did not run the line straight from the ridge." Sheriff Cole leaned closer. Why not? Granite shelf. Chain would not lie flat. Gideon closed his eyes, reaching through 12 years of memory. They dog-legged east toward the warm spring. Samuel said the surveyor marked the turn where the old spring box stood. Hannah frowned. There has never been a spring box, not since the flood. The flood of 1879 had ripped through the upper meadow, carrying trees, fencing, and half a smokehouse into the river. Gideon pushed himself upright. The box was built from larch logs. Samuel rebuilt the channel over it, said the old timber was too deep to pull. Caleb grabbed his coat. Where? Under the north bank, near the cottonwood with the lightning scar. The storm had weakened by noon, but the cold had hardened the meadow like iron. Caleb, Hannah, Sheriff Cole, and Toby dug beside the spring while Gideon directed them from the bank. They found stones, frozen roots, a rusted horseshoe. Nothing else. Hours passed. The light began to fail. Hannah's hands bled through her gloves. Caleb drove the pick again. The point struck wood. Everyone stopped. They cleared the ice and mud from a blackened larch beam buried beneath the bank. One end carried 3 square cuts, the old surveyor's witness mark. Caleb dug deeper. Beneath the beam sat an iron cap the size of a coffee cup, green with age and stamped with a federal survey number. 1482, the missing book. Sheriff Cole exhaled. This proves a marker was set here. Hannah looked at him, but not which direction the line ran. The sheriff nodded reluctantly. Rusk will say the marker was moved. The proof was real. It was not enough. Then Toby, crouched in the hole, brushed mud from the underside of the beam. Something is nailed here. A narrow copper tube had been flattened against the wood and sealed with pitch. Caleb worked it loose. Inside was a strip of oilskin wrapped around a page covered in faded pencil. Field notes. Not the official survey, but the surveyor's own measurements. The line ran east at the spring, exactly as Gideon remembered. At the bottom were 2 witness signatures, Samuel Vale and Asa Bell. Gideon looked at the name. Asa was the chainman. Is he alive? Caleb asked. Gideon nodded slowly. Last I heard, he kept a smithy outside Stevensville. The hearing began at 10 the next morning. Asa Bell arrived at 9:58. He was 61. A black Civil War veteran with a stiff left hand and a memory sharper than the attorney who tried to break it. He placed his old survey chain on the judge's table. I carried this chain through Section 18 in June of 1874, he said. The granite shelf forced a turn. We set the iron cap at the spring and marked the larch box because the ground was unstable. Rusk's attorney lifted the oilskin note. This paper could have been placed there at any time. Asa looked at him. So could your client's claim. A few men in the room coughed to hide their laughter. Judge Holt did not smile. She compared the iron cap number, the field note, Asa's chain book, and Rusk's map. Then Sheriff Cole placed one more item before her. The missing pages from Survey Book 14. He had found them that morning beneath a false bottom in the document case carried by Rusk's clerk. The clerk had confessed before breakfast. Judge Holt read in silence. When she finished, she turned to Silas Rusk. Your filing does not correct an old boundary. Her voice was calm. It attempts to erase one. Rusk stood. Judge, sit down. He did. The order came quickly. Rusk's claim was void. The spring, the upper meadow, and the full water right belonged to Red Willow Ranch. The county referred the missing records and false filing for criminal investigation. Rusk's cattle were to be removed from the spring bank before sundown. Hannah did not cheer. She simply lowered her head and pressed one hand over her mouth. Toby leaned against her. Gideon removed his hat. Caleb watched the tension leave Hannah's shoulders for the first time since he had known her. Outside the courthouse, Asa Bell handed Caleb the old survey chain. Keep men honest with it. Caleb shook his head. That belongs with you. Asa looked toward Hannah and Toby. No, it belongs where the line held. By dusk, word had crossed the valley. The next morning, 12 riders came to Red Willow, then another wagon, then 2 more. One neighbor brought hay, another brought posts. A blacksmith reset the spring gate. 2 ranch women arrived with bread, preserved peaches, and enough wool batting to finish every winter quilt in the cabin. No one called it charity, they called it work. Caleb understood the difference. For 9 days the ranch rebuilt. The spring bank was stoned and fenced properly. A separate trough line was cut for the cattle. The dead heifer was buried beneath the ridge. The barn received new braces. Gideon supervised from a chair and insulted everyone's measurements equally. Toby painted the Red Willow sign again. The letters were crooked. No one corrected them. On Christmas Eve, Silas Bell's freight foreman rode in from Missoula with Caleb's next contract. 2 winter runs a month, a full team of his own by spring, steady pay, a future he could name. Caleb signed the contract, folded it, and placed it in his coat. Then he walked to the barn and began saddling his horse. Hannah found him tightening the cinch. "You are leaving. Freight run starts after Christmas." "After the run?" Caleb kept his eyes on the buckle. "Belle has a room over the warehouse." Toby appeared in the doorway. "We have a room." Caleb looked at him. The boy folded his arms in a perfect imitation of Gideon. "It leaks less now," Gideon called from the cabin. "And the barn is not a room, Shaw." Caleb smiled despite himself. Hannah stepped closer. "You said you spent your first freight share where it started." "I did. Then perhaps you should decide where the next part starts." Caleb finally looked at her. The trail had taught him how to leave before anyone could ask him to stay. It had kept him alive, and it had kept him alone. Hannah held no debt over him, no bargain, no promise of easy years, only a place at a table he had once approached as a stranger. That evening the 4 of them sat beneath lamplight while snow covered the yard. The table held venison stew, potatoes, 2 loaves of bread, dried apples, and coffee strong enough to satisfy Gideon. Hannah filled a bowl and placed it before Caleb. He looked down at it. Toby noticed. "What?" Caleb ran one thumb along the warm rim. "The first bowl I ate here was the last food in the house." Hannah sat across from him. "Not the last. It should have been. That is not the same thing." Caleb looked around the room. At Gideon pretending not to listen. At Toby wearing boots that finally fit. At the window glass holding back the wind. At the old survey chain hanging beside the door, each iron link dark against the wall. He had returned with Wagons because he believed a debt needed paying. Now he understood. Some kindness could not be repaid, it could only be continued. Caleb removed his hat and set it on the empty chair beside him. "I would like to come back after every freight run," Toby grinned. Gideon lifted his coffee. Hannah's eyes shone in the lamplight, but her voice remained steady. "Then stop calling it coming back." Caleb waited. She smiled. "Call it coming home." Outside, the Montana winter pressed against Red Willow Ranch with all the cold it had. Inside, a widow served supper to the man she had once fed with her final bowl. She had kept a stranger alive for one night. He spent the rest of his life keeping the cold from her door.